Those gorgeous silver lines with that beautiful red tinge to them that you just saw was an incredible experiment, pun intended, that we did a while back where we combined the high quality Prink K60 silver paint formula with the new Inkredible ink by On the Run. And what did it do? It mixed perfectly. You can check that video out in the corner where the cards are, or in the description of course, but it was right then that I knew that this ink was going to be a fun one to work with on its own as well. And that is exactly what we're going to be doing today, guys, while we do number one, a full surface tagging test with the OTR 972 Inkredible ink, and secondly, a buff test using some of the most common buffing materials that those buffers are going to try to use to remove your nice inky tags. So if that sounds good to you guys, let's get right into it. So I'm just going to briefly mention the things that graffiti artists and graffiti writers are going to need to know who are considering trying out this OTR Inkredible ink for themselves. So this stuff is at least what they're calling heavy duty industrial ink, and on the label it puts an emphasis on permanence and weatherproofness. It does not in any way say that it's buff proof or anything like that, but it does emphasize those permanence aspects of it. It says highly permanent, weatherproof, and ultra UV resistant as well. Whatever that means for an ink. Those of us who have used many inks over the years will know that in general inks are not that ultra UV resistant, but hey, who knows. This one in particular here says it's an alcohol-based ink. Those of you who don't know, inks in particular have a soluble pigment, which means it dissolves in the other fluids that make up the ink. That solubility is what helps these inks bind to a surface and actually stain a surface, or stain something that's trying to cover it up and bleed through. The Inkredible ink bottles here come in 120 milliliters, and one of these babies will put you out about $12 US. To break that down, that's a nice easy $1 per 10 milliliters. OTR currently only offers the Inkredible ink in either black or red, so a bit more of a limited color selection than you see with some other brands, although not too limited considering that most inks are like that. I do have to say the sort of spout opening at the top is quite nice for filling up your mops, but that, speaking of mops, is going to be the real test. How does this write in your everyday graffiti mops? And that's exactly what we're going to be testing out right now as we fill up a mop with this Inkredible ink and start our surface test. And after that, of course, we'll be answering the question, how does this stand up to a little bit of buffing? So with that in mind, let's head over to our testing area and start throwing some tags up. Welcome to the testing area, everyone. Today we have two sort of surfaces. One is this nice silky smooth, one of the smoothest you could possibly want to write on with a mop. Those are always super fun, so we're going to write on that. And then we have the same surface but an unfinished version of that surface to sort of help this ink settle into the surface a little bit, give it a chance to bite that surface, which could make a difference for the buff test. We will see. So without further ado, let's start tagging up some subscribers' names who have asked me for hit-offs in a video, or names of those who have supported me on my Patreon, things like that, or bought some of the ScizGraff merch that we have here. And while we tag up those subscribers' names, I'll be giving you guys an idea of two things in particular. One is what we like to call the drippability here on the channel of this Inkredible ink, which is really just how viscous the Inkredible ink is. And secondly, the color. Now I know there's only two colors you can possibly get this ink in. It really is much more of a bomber-oriented ink in that respect, as are most inks. But the color it produces does speak to how consistent the formula is and how precisely formulated it is as well. So we want to pay attention to those two aspects of this ink in particular, as well as, of course, I'll be trying to give you guys my commentary on just how it feels to write with this ink in a fairly standard graffiti mop that I have cleaned out here so we get a true representation of the Inkredible ink by OTR here. So I'll be trying to tell you guys how it feels to write with this ink, what I'm getting a sense of that you might not be able to explicitly see on camera yourself. So let's fill this beauty up and get some tags down.
Perfect.
So I think it took about a tag and a half just to clear the nib of any leftover paint debris that was in it. Look at that color, jeez. Look how gorgeous this is too. Holy hell. Right after that, you could tell it was still just a really, really nice red we're working with here. But they really nailed it with this red. I'd actually go as far as saying that the color as a whole is more of like a mid-tone red. You picture ink colors always being on the darker side. This one's on the darker side too, but it's much lighter than a lot of inks you might get. I think that's a really nice touch. Just the red itself, I was very impressed with. Something I do want to point out is just sort of the way the ink settles at the bottom of these lines. That's always been something really, really awesome to look at because those lines almost creates the illusion of a bit of a three-dimensional tag with maybe a bit of a drop shadow type thing going on there. Love that look. That's just incredible to see. And this ink does that very well. And to me, that gets into the formulation part of what we're talking about here. And the formula is just consistent. It's a great formula, it seems like to me. It's very well put together. What you're always worried about with an ink is just that the binder isn't going to be quite there. But this one definitely has that going for it. It gets those nice drips, sort of where you'd expect at the ends of letters and whatnot, but they're not overpowering the tag. I was squeezing a normal amount, just what I'm used to. And using the Molotow dripstick, I think, is actually a very good choice for this because even though it's called a Molotow dripstick, I've said this in past videos on the Molotow dripstick, it's a little bit of a harder mop. And using a bit of a harder mop with an ink is always a little bit nicer, I find. That's just a personal sort of feel. And being that it is that sort of consistency and viscosity, you don't really feel like you're wasting a lot of ink, which is always nice as well, because specifically with inks and ones in, you know, those 120 milliliter bottles, if you do get this nice sort of viscosity, this ink can go pretty far for 120 mils, which is something a lot of the more budget conscious writers among us will be concerned about. I'm always concerned about that. As for the feel, again, I just have to emphasize that because this ink is a little bit on the thicker side, I would say, for an ink specifically, obviously not compared to paints, but for an ink specifically, it does feel just very comfortable to write with if you're someone like me who's used to using paints more often. I found it to be a very nice sort of mid-range, consistent formula to work with in terms of that viscosity, so it's definitely a nice one to work with if you are used to working with paints more often. I guess I should comment specifically on the differences between the unfinished and the finished surfaces here. The unfinished, I obviously sort of prefer that more because the drips are just a little more controlled. Drips are drips, but I don't love a million of them in one place. That being said though, the finished surface here that we have, you do really start to see those drips flowing. Hopefully you're getting a bit of a good idea of just how this formula will look if you're going to write on sort of glass surfaces with it, tile surfaces, finished surfaces like that. That inks traditionally have a hard time binding to and biting. Of course, on those finished surfaces, you do see a bit more streakiness in the lines, but that is natural and a direct result of the surface we're using a mop on, so that's certainly no fault of the ink itself. So I feel like I could talk all day about this Inkredible ink, but I think I've given you guys the best idea that I can just by showing you a few tags in a standard graffiti mop with the Inkredible ink. So as promised, we are going to now test, I guess, the character of this Inkredible ink from OTR by doing a good old-fashioned buff test with some of the standard materials that those buff clowns out there trying to take your tags down are going to be using. And I do have to give credit to, I believe that his username is Mallard Ducks, for that term buff clowns. He said that's what he calls the buff man, and I saw that and immediately loved it. But anyway, what we're going to do here is we're going to let this settle in and seep into the surface a little bit on the unfinished and the sort of more finished surface here before we try and buff this with some of the sort of household buffing materials that a lot of people will be able to get their hands on to try and buff tags like this. And after that, at the end, I'll be able to tell you guys, as a graffiti writer, what kind of graffiti artists and graffiti writers might want to give this ink a try and who among us might want to just give it a pass. So let's give this a chance to settle, shall we?
Perfect.
Okay, so firstly, we're gonna do it on the finished surface and see. Number one, I have some standard acetone here that we're gonna use. By the way, I should be wearing gloves. This is dry to the touch. Let's see what acetone can do to it here. Yeah, just a little bit of acetone and it's coming right off. Recharge our buffing material a little bit here. I'm just soaking like a little spot here. But as you can see, it rips right through it. It doesn't stand a chance. So like, not worried days yet. So I don't know, some of the more bomber-oriented graffiti artists here might be saying, okay, well, is this ink actually any good right now? Well, let's just try standard off-the-shelf graffiti remover here. So what this does is, yeah, you can see the effect of that right there before we do anything. So you know exactly what's coming when we do that. That picks that up right there. And again, I'll say, it doesn't stand a chance. That's on the finished surface though. Let's try something up here a little bit on our unfinished surface. Okay, so on the unfinished surface here, we got our little acetone towel again. Let's see what it does to this bliss tag. Well, it's leaving an okay ghost there. I'm getting a ton of acetone now just to see if we can do anything here. Wow. Look at that. So, I mean, you can lighten this up quite a bit, but that is a very, very clear, beautiful ghost of a tag right there, and that is just gorgeous to see. It doesn't really matter how hard I push on it either, like that's just there for the long haul, you could say. But some slightly less well-versed people in buffing might just be using a standard graffiti buffer, so let's see if it fares any better on this tag. Oh, we're not getting as much of the runniness right away. Wow. All right, last try before we make any conclusions here. Oof. So I think I have to conclude here that there's just a very clear ghost of a tag here. Clearly is still a bliss tag. To me, that just stood up to the buff with your standard buffing materials. And that's very encouraging, especially with acetone being one of the heavier chemicals that people try and use for buffing, and it didn't do that much to this actually. So you might be left wondering now, are there any downsides to this ink? Well, I guess the best way to do that is let's just sit down, have a quick chat, and I'll let you know some of the pros and cons of this ink and who among us graffiti writers will probably enjoy using such an ink. Okay, so pros and cons of this ink. Who's it for? What are we looking at here? Well, the main thing I would say about this ink, if someone were to ask me to sum it up in a phrase or two, is just that it's a really well formulated ink. It definitely displayed that sort of consistency and a really professionally engineered ink is, I guess, how you could state it. And to further that statement, you did see that the ink does have that bite to it. It can settle into a surface depending on what the surface is. That's not to say it's entirely buff proof, and specifically the second surface where it did sort of leave a bit of a ghost of a tag is a polyplastic, which those tend to really absorb inks quite easily, and they're one of the harder surfaces to buff. So it might not do as well on some other surfaces, but in general, I think the ink is quite strong. So you have a strong, well-formulated ink here. Now, those are the two pros of the ink, and obviously I think the bomber-oriented graffiti writers, especially the drip heads, are licking their lips right now thinking, yeah, let me get my hands on this. And that's probably how I'd sum up the people who are going to be interested in using this ink. If you are a sort of graffiti bomber oriented type artist, then this is for you. There's no two ways about it. It works beautifully in any kind of standard mop. The dripstick here was a nice one to use with it, I think. I just wanted to give it a chance to shine and show what a pretty standard 10mm nib can do to lay some lines down with the Inkredible ink. The only people I think should just not really touch this ink are if you're looking for a lot of variety, if you're looking for a lot of colors here, then obviously that's just not gonna happen here. And I don't think it's too likely to happen in the future either. I would doubt that the product depth is going to be expanded anytime soon with regards to color palette. The only other aspect of it that's a little bit irritating is the aspect that's always irritating no matter what you're buying, and that is the price. 12 USD for 120 mils, that's not cheap, let's face it. As I said before, 10 mils per dollar. You really gotta watch your pocket on that a little bit. It's far from the cheapest kind of ink you can get. It's also far from the most expensive though, so it is probably a nice mid-range ink. And if you look at the overall value to see if this is an ink for you, I would just say figure out what you want this ink for and then look at the aspects of this ink that are what I was saying are the pros and the cons. That'll sort of help you figure out if it is an ink for you. If you are interested in a little bit more on the Molotow Dripstick 860DS here that I did a full comprehensive review on the Molotow Dripsticks. You can check that out on screen now. I hope to see y'all over there. Until then, peace.